And we're in a waiting game. We think the RCMP is going to roll in really any day and start arresting people. But we also think that the logging company knows that, when they start arresting people, when they start moving peaceful protesters forcibly to log trees that are 2,000 years old, that's going to be a moment of reckoning. And that when that does start happening, we think that that's going to be a catalyst for real action across the province, because the BC government has been ignoring what's happening to our old growth forests for decades.
There is something crazy going on right now in Fairy Creek. Ancient yellow cedars are at risk of logging by the Teal Jones group. This became a prevalent issue in August of 2020, when a 17-year-old filmmaker by the name of Joshua Wright used special digital mapping programs to monitor logging activities. He found out that there were road building crews subcontracted to the Teal Jones group. Outside of parks, Fairy Creek is one of the last unlogged old-growth valleys on southern Vancouver Island. Activists are blockading in Fairy Creek to prevent the cutting of the last old growth in that area.
For a long time, I've sort of loved the forests on Vancouver Island and the forests in the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Washington State originally. I'd start looking at maps and look at satellite imagery of these forests and look at the logging approvals. And I look at as logging companies go to these new areas, get new approvals to log, clear cut these old growth forests. And last summer, a friend of a friend put me in touch with a friend of a friend, and I got in touch with this group of people who wanted to start doing direct action for forests on Vancouver Island. And at the same time, I'd been watching as Teal Jones started road building into this valley that at the time it wasn't really on people's radars, this area called Fairy Creek. I notified them that there was road building happening there, and a few weeks later, much to my surprise, there were blockades on the ground and sort of things started rolling. And since then, I've just basically been keeping track of where the logging company is going, where they're getting new approvals, and then I'll communicate that to people on the ground, and the people on the ground will go stop them from the logging that I see happening via satellites.
These are 2,000-year-old trees, 1,000-year-old trees, 1,500-year-old trees that are going to be cut down that cannot ever be replaced.
Yeah, there's also areas where it's safe and will never be cut down.
Fairy Creek lies in the unceded territory of the Pachida First Nation. The Pachida people and other First Nations have lived and sustained themselves on the Vancouver Island for thousands of generations.
Our blockades are on Pachita territory under the invitation of Elder Bill Jones, who is called Fairy Creek, sort of one of the last intimate places of our souls. He has very stirring words about Fairy Creek and about its importance, and stories of him as a child, going into Fairy Creek and hunting with his uncles in Fairy Creek.
The current situation we see in Fairy Creek is not new. The War in the Woods was a series of protests and blockades related to logging on the Vancouver Island. It was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history, and it served a similar purpose to what we see happening today. The peaceful protests from 1980 to 1994 accumulated immense national and international support. The protesters blocked entrances to the forest for over a decade, with logging companies now attempting to enter Fairy Creek and its surrounding areas once again. We see a repeated tale.
Well, actually, a lot of the same people are still there, except they're 80 now. And they're willing to climb trees and chain themselves to trees. It's quite incredible to see senior citizens that dedicated.
This dynamic mirrors the human ordeal over the preservation of Earth's resources, the ability for the First Nations to safeguard their lands, and the ability for the loggers to earn their wages.
The situation with the First Nations, though, in British Columbia is that many of the First Nations are economically dependent on industries that are destroying their land base, that are destroying their traditional territory. And they're often put in a choice where they can either log or they can have no business and live in poverty. It's not really genuine to say, oh, look, the Pachita want to log, when that's their only option. One of our core demands is that the government provide economic alternatives, conservation financing for First Nations and for rural communities, so that they actually have other options, because right now the only option for these communities is to keep on logging.
The current situation on the ground is complicated. Earlier this month, the governing council announced that activists were no longer welcome in Fairy Creek.
The band council is very pro-logging, and they've asked us to basically go elsewhere and that they don't want us interfering on their lands. And right now, that happened a few weeks ago, and it sort of brought up a lot of like, okay, what do we do under the circumstance? And what we ultimately ended up listening to Bill Jones, who said, don't leave, because if you leave, it's all for nothing.
On top of that, the Fairy Creek has been blockaded for months since August 2020 to protect the last old growth of Vancouver. Recently, the BC Supreme Court granted an injunction on April 1st, allowing for arrests within the blockade.
Right now, forest defenders have been on the ground at Fairy Creek for over 8 months. For the first 6 months of the direct action, the logging company just sort of backed off, but now they've gotten an injunction against us, which now allows the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to come in and arrest us for blocking the logging equipment. What will happen in terms of when they start arresting people is they'll show up to camp, they'll serve the injunction, and they'll probably bring, loggers with them. And at that point, anybody who chooses to directly defy the injunction would get arrested and would have would be charged with contempt of court, which is like a pretty low level offense. You might get a few hours of community service for it. And it's a civil infraction, won't go on your criminal record. So it's pretty painless as far as arrests go.
With the court injunction being served, how has that impacted the situation on the ground? How are people feeling right now?
Well, actually, it brought more people together with some really good skill sets, and they're digging in.
Over the years, the British Columbian forests have become privatized, thus allowing for the lumber industry to go unchecked.
There are these really massive logging companies, the Teal Jones Group, which is the one that owns a tenure around Fairy Creek, Western Forest Products, Interfor, Canfor, West Fraser, like just these pretty massive companies, and their business is essentially deforestation. They are companies that are still operating as if old growth wasn't a finite resource, and they're logging old growth forests in the exact same way that companies in Indonesia are clearing the rainforest for palm oil.
According to Sierra Club, BC Vancouver Island has lost over 30% of its original forests over the past 25 years, leaving less than 3% of endangered old growth trees.
It's an entire ecosystem. This is the last of an ecosystem. It's the last few percent. And this ecosystem is the most biodiverse ecosystem, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems per acre in the world. It's one of the most carbon dense ecosystems on Earth. The amount of carbon these forests sequester, the old growth forests sequester, is absolutely hard to imagine, just the quantity of biomass in these forests.
Put a pause on it and consult with First Nations, and let's see what happens at the end of the day. But there's no sense cutting all these trees down and then talking about it, and talking while they're coming down. These conversations have to be had, and we're hoping that provincial party realizes that, and I hope they save Fairy Creek first of all, but they haven't even done that yet. They can't even get Bill Jones's little forest park.
Right now, the camps, they have wildly varying numbers. Sometimes, when we expect the RCMP to show up, we can have hundreds of people on the ground. I think right now each camp has something like 10 apiece, and then the KQs have probably 30, and HQ has probably 30 as well. There are 5 camps. One in the KQs is where we recently stopped the active logging of old growth forests, and that's where we expect the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, to show up any day and start arresting people. So that's sort of our front line right now. Then we have Edinburgh Mountain at Eden Camp, which is protecting some forests near Eden Grove. We have the Walbrown Watch Camp, which is probably the least eventful camp right now. And then we have Camper Creek Watch Camp. And then we have the main HQ, which is near River Camp. And River Camp is the main blockade preventing logging in the Fairy Creek Rainforest. And right now, in that location, people are spaced out along the road, camping in socially distanced pods. Because of the surging coronavirus, we're being exceedingly careful. Basically what camp looks like right now is people coming self-sufficient and staying for as long as they possibly can in case the RCMP do show up.
As time goes on, things can change very rapidly. Without a doubt, the ancient forests of the world are at risk. And if we don't stand up for them now, we won't have any more left to stand up for.
In British Columbia, the biggest thing you can do is come to the blockades. And, we are following all COVID restrictions. So socially distance, don't come in crowds, like all of that stuff, drive your own car, all of that. Make it out to the blockades if you possibly can, though, because we are expecting the RCMP to come very soon. If you want to join the blockades, all you have to do is read our camp handbook, which is on our website, which is laststandforforests.com. Right now, it is technically, there is an injunction against us, but it's not illegal to be there as an individual. And then beyond that, call Premier John Horgan.
There's a GoFundMe. You can also make all sorts of calls to MPPs or MLAs and John Horgan's office. Oh, for sure, the head forester as well is even a good one to phone, because he's supposed to be kind of independent. So maybe you start telling him how come they're cutting all the creeks right to the riverbeds. Like, it's just unbelievable.
Premier John Horgan basically has the power to protect these forests if he wanted to, and right now he's jerking his campaign promise, so you can call him. His number is 250-387-1715, and tell him that we need a moratorium on old growth logging, that we need conservation financing for the communities who rely on old growth logging. Make it known to the political leaders that this is outrageous, this is absolutely outrageous, and that this absolutely needs to change.